One casual gesture from Johnny Carson could make you a millionaire overnight, or his silence could end your career forever. Tonight, the 7 couch invitations that launched comedy legends and the secret blacklist that destroyed the ones who crossed him. Ellen DeGeneres, Engineering the Impossible. November 28, 1986. Ellen DeGeneres walked into the Tonight Show studio with a goal that bordered on delusional: become the first woman ever invited to Johnny Carson's couch on her very first appearance. No woman had done it. Almost no man had, either. Most comics treated Carson sets like live jazz loose, riffy, authentic. Ellen did the opposite. She built a machine. Her phone call to God routine was scripted like a one-person play. Every pause, every breath, every eye movement was chosen. She rehearsed in front of mirrors, taped herself, rewound obsessively. Weeks of this alone, drilling a 7-minute bit like it was a Broadway monologue. There was a problem. Carson prized effortlessness. Anything that felt over-rehearsed could read as needy or false. And Ellen was staking everything on the most rehearsed thing she'd ever done. Female comics in 1986 had narrow lanes, glamorous chatterboxes or self-deprecating jokers about looks and husbands. You could be likable, or you could be ambitious. You were not supposed to look like you had engineered your own coronation. Ellen had spent nearly a decade on the road, working clean, observational rooms from New Orleans to small southern clubs. No profanity, no explicit shock value, just everyday absurdity filtered through a calm, conversational tone. She knew she could not outshout or outshock the guys. She would have to outthink them. Phone call to God was her answer. The premise was simple. What if you could call God and ask all the questions that never made sense? Why fleas? Why the giraffe's ridiculous neck? Why bananas with packaging that requires tools? The jokes landed softly at first, then built. Each question layered onto the last, shifting from silly to quietly philosophical and back again. Her timing felt effortless because it had been drilled past perfection into muscle memory. The audience was not watching a comic cycle through disconnected jokes. They were watching a fully formed worldview unfold in real time. The biggest question in the room was not Ellen's. It was Carson's. Is this for real? At first, his face was a mask, the same inscrutable look that haunted generations of comics. But as Ellen settled into the rhythm, Carson leaned forward. You could see it. He was listening, not just waiting for a punchline. Then she stuck the landing. Carson called the set very clever and very fresh, then did something even more valuable. He compared her to Bob Newhart, the patron saint of calm, structurally perfect observational comedy. For any comic, that was gold. For a woman trying to be judged outside the female comic box, it was transformative. And then came the moment she had engineered in secret. Carson gestured to the couch. Ellen DeGeneres became the first woman in Tonight Show history invited over on her debut. The bit had worked exactly as designed. What looked like spontaneous discovery was, underneath, a feat of engineering. Years later, she admitted the whole thing had been a calculated heist. She had studied tapes of other comics who got the couch, noticed that Carson rewarded a fully realized point of view more than a string of jokes. Phone Call to God was built precisely to showcase that. The couch moment unlocked everything that followed. Recurring late-night appearances, sitcom opportunities, eventually a daytime empire that would run 19 seasons. Ellen had not just made Carson laugh. She had cracked the code of the most powerful gate in American comedy and walked straight through it. Drew Carey, The Final Year Magic, November 8, 1991. Backstage at The Tonight Show, Drew Carey was not just nervous, he was watching the clock on an era run out. Carson had already announced his retirement. Every comic knew. This was not just a late-night set. It was one of the last shots at the Carson anointing, ever. Carey did not look like television's next multimillionaire. He was a former Marine and perpetual regular guy from Cleveland who had bounced through bank jobs, cab driving, and food service before stumbling onto an open microphone in 1985. By 1991, he had spent 6 years grinding through the Midwest circuit, doing $50 sets in half-full clubs. His hook was not a wild persona. It was how completely unslick he was. But that unslickness posed a risk. Carson's stage was where careers were either launched into orbit or frozen in place. He walked out anyway. Carey opened with jokes about his appearance, but they did not feel like self-loathing. The subtext was not, please like me despite this. It was, this is who I am. Let us laugh about it together. That distinction confidence instead of apology made audiences lean in. He pivoted into job hunting, skewering ridiculous interview questions, the fake enthusiasm of hiring managers, the humiliations of needing work more than they needed you. It was specific enough to be funny, universal enough to hit almost everyone in the room. Within a minute, you could hear it. The audience was not just laughing at jokes. They were relaxing with someone they trusted. Then the invisible test, Carson's reaction. After 30 years, Carson could sense gimmicks a mile away. Drew did not have one. What he had was warmth and precision. As Carey's set unfolded, Carson's body language shifted head forward, eyes on the comic, the subtle signs that meant, this guy has it. Carey finished, thanked the crowd, and turned to leave. By his own later account, he was already thrilled he had not bombed in front of Johnny Carson in Johnny Carson's final year. That alone felt like a win. Then Carson moved his hand. The invitation to the couch came like a plot twist, sudden, simple, and life-splitting. Before this gesture, Carey was a working comic from Cleveland. After it, he was someone Johnny Carson had personally endorsed in the twilight of his reign. On the couch, Carson treated him not as a nervous newcomer, but as a peer. He asked about Carey's background, his time in the Marines, his path into comedy, and actually listened. Freed from the pressure of the set, Drew got funnier, looser, more himself. The payoff was swift and measurable. Within weeks, his club fees tripled. Industry people who had never heard his name were now asking to meet. Talent agents who had passed on him 6 months earlier were suddenly returning calls. The same jokes, the same delivery, the same guy. But now he had the one thing that made Hollywood pay attention: Johnny Carson's stamp of approval. Within a few years, the Drew Carey Show premiered on American Broadcasting Company television, anchoring their lineup for 9 seasons. The show was built around the exact persona Carson had validated: an ordinary, likable, slightly rumpled everyman navigating a world that never quite made sense. By the final season, he was earning $750,000 per episode. The former bank teller and cab driver now made more in a week than he once did in a year. All off a 7-minute set and one quiet gesture from a man about to hand over the keys to late-night television. If you are enjoying this journey through Carson's most life-changing couch invitations so far, you may wish to subscribe now and turn on notifications so you can stay with us through all 7 stories and the surprising legacy they left behind. But not every Carson story ends in triumph. Freddie Prinze, the cautionary tale. In 1973, a 19-year-old kid walked onto the Tonight Show stage and changed what Latino comedy could look like on American television. Within 3 years, that same kid's life would take a tragic turn. Freddie Prinze called himself Hungarican, half Hungarian, half Puerto Rican, and his act sounded nothing like the safe, whitewashed material network audiences were used to. His jokes came straight from New York streets: muggers, multilingual neighbors, chaotic apartment buildings. He did not perform ethnic humor as a stereotype. He performed his actual life. That authenticity was his rocket fuel and his ticking clock. Network television in 1973 was overwhelmingly white. Latino voices were almost non-existent. Prinze stepped onto Carson's stage, not as comic relief, but as the star. Most comics over-prepared for Carson, polishing every line. Prinze kept the looseness of the clubs. He had already survived brutal New York rooms since 17. If he watered himself down for Middle America, he would lose the rawness that made him special. So he did not. On stage, he flowed. He told stories about growing up in a mixed neighborhood, doing pitch-perfect impressions of the people around him. His iconic bit Latino guy getting mugged and turning it into a fashion compliment, looking good, landed like a cultural grenade. It was funny, yes, but it also announced, we are here, and we get to tell the jokes now. Then Carson gave the signal. Not only did he call Freddie over, Prinze sat down between Johnny Carson and Sammy Davis Jr., a 19-year-old from a rough New York background suddenly framed as an equal to 2 show business legends. The image alone told every executive watching, this kid is not small time. The National Broadcasting Company moved fast. Within months, they built Chico and the man around him. The show premiered in 1974 and rocketed into the top 3 rated programs almost instantly. Prinze, barely out of his teens, was making $50,000 an episode. The rise was dizzying. Within a year, Freddie was on magazine covers, doing talk shows, and being pitched movies. He had what every comic dreamed of: money, fame, a hit sitcom with his name above the title. Teenagers recognized him on the street. Executives who had never heard of Washington Heights were now flying him first class to pitch meetings in Los Angeles. He was 19 years old when Carson changed his life. By 20, he was one of the most famous young performers in America. The distance between those two realities, kid from the neighborhood and network star, was supposed to take a decade. Freddie covered it in months, but there was a cost. No one in the system was built to handle. Underneath the charisma, Prinze was struggling with depression and the crushing pressure of holding up a network show as a teenager. He was not just making people laugh. He was responsible for ratings, jobs, advertising revenue, and for embodying Latino visibility almost single-handedly on primetime television. The industry that had vaulted him upward had no safety net when the pressure turned toxic. There were no mental health infrastructures for young stars suddenly burdened with adult-level responsibility. In January of 1977, 3.5 years after that first Carson set, Freddie Prinze tragically ended his own life. He was 22 years old. His story became the whispered warning behind every overnight success tale. Carson's couch could turn a kid from the neighborhood into the lead of a hit sitcom almost instantly. What it could not do was teach him how to live with that velocity. The same 7 minutes that made him immortal as a trailblazer also set in motion a life he was never given time or support to fully grow into. Joan Rivers. A decade of rejection. Validated. By February 1965, Joan Rivers had been chasing one door for 10 years, and it kept slamming in her face. She had clawed her way through Greenwich Village clubs, honing a brutally confessional style. She joked about being unattractive, desperate to marry, useless in the kitchen, but not as cute self-mockery. Her tone was sharp, almost aggressive, as if daring audiences to look away. Bookers hated it. The Village scene was birthing giants: Lenny Bruce, Woody Allen, Bill Cosby, but nearly all of them were men. Women could be whimsical, self-effacing, or wholesome. Rivers was none of the above. She was too New York, too ethnic, too negative, too old at 31, according to a rotating cast of Tonight Show talent scouts. They rejected her 7 times. Each no cut deeper. Rivers watched male peers she considered less original land Carson spots while she kept grinding for low pay. She later described this period as the loneliest stretch of her career, not because she lacked ambition, but because she had so much of it and nowhere to put it. Every rejection confirmed what the industry seemed to believe. Women like her did not belong on national television. When she finally broke through, it was not as a full-fledged stand-up, but as a writer participant, a hedged bet that signaled lingering doubt. She walked onto Carson's stage knowing this might be her only shot and that the gatekeepers already half expected her to fail. Instead of softening, she doubled down. On air, Rivers talked about her looks and marriage prospects with lethal honesty. She did not pretend she was fine. She admitted she was terrified of being alone, panicked about aging. The laughs came wrapped around flinches. Audiences were not used to women admitting this much on television. The studio laughed. But the real verdict sat behind the desk. Carson started to lose it. He wiped away tears, his laughter unmistakably genuine. For a host famous for cool reserve, this mattered. He was not just amused, he was delighted by how unapologetically Joan was being Joan. Then he delivered the line that detonated a decade of rejection. "God, you are funny," Carson said on air. "You are going to be a star." He almost never said things like that. Certainly not about a woman the industry had already labeled over at 31. Overnight, that single sentence rewrote her value. Agents who had ignored her called. Clubs that underpaid her offered headlining money. Producers started asking, what can we build around her? 18 years later, the validation went even further. In 1983, Joan Rivers became The Tonight Show's first permanent guest host, filling in for Carson so often. She practically became the show's second heartbeat. For the woman they had rejected 7 times, the symbolism was surgical. She was not just allowed on the set now, she was trusted to sit in Carson's chair. Of course, that partnership would later implode in one of television's most famous feuds. But in 1965, on that first consequential night, the arc was clear. 10 years of no, 1 explosive yes. And a single sentence from Johnny Carson that overruled an entire industry's judgment live, in front of America. Carson's couch could validate a decade of struggle, but could it validate something truly bizarre? Stephen Wright, discovered in a Chinese restaurant. In 1982, The Tonight Show's talent producer Peter Lassily followed a strange tip. There is a guy in a Chinese restaurant in Boston you have to see, not a club. A restaurant. The place was called the Ding Ho Half Comedy Stage, half egg roll joint. It was part of a fiercely original Boston scene producing oddballs like Paula Poundstone, Bobcat Goldthwait, and Lenny Clark. On stage that night was Stephen Wright, radiating the stage presence of an exhausted substitute teacher. He barely moved. He spoke in a flat, unchanging monotone. No mugging, no big act-outs, no, "How is everybody doing tonight?" His jokes sounded like logic problems from an alternate universe. "I bought a house on a one-way, no-through street. I do not know how I got there. I spilled spot remover on my dog. Now he is gone." And then, without changing his expression even slightly, "I have a map of the United States, actual size. It says 1 mile equals 1 mile. Every joke was a perfectly built paradox. Set up a plausible premise, then follow it to an impossible conclusion, and deliver it as if you are reading a bus schedule. Lastly had a dilemma. Boston loved weird things. The Tonight Show's audience was mainstream America, people folding laundry in Des Moines at 11:45 at night. Would they get this? Would Carson? They decided to risk it. When Wright stepped onto Carson's stage, he did exactly what he had done at the Ding Ho. Stood still, monotone, stone-faced, to the point of discomfort. The first couple of jokes got confused laughter. You could hear the audience trying to calibrate. Then something clicked. Once people understood that this was the joke, the absurd logic, the total lack of emotional signaling, each new line hit harder. The laughs rolled in late but loud, like everyone had to solve the joke in their head before reacting. Carson, who had seen every setup punchline trick in the book for 30 years, started cracking up. Not politely. He was genuinely tickled by the internal architecture of Wright's jokes. He recognized the craftsmanship hidden inside the weirdness. That laugh was permission. If Johnny Carson found this hysterical, then it was not just weird, it was sophisticated. The audience relaxed. If the king of mainstream comedy was doubled over, they did not need to pretend anymore. They could simply enjoy it. Overnight, Wright became the surrealist you had to pretend to get even if you did not. Comedy clubs that would never have booked his style were now calling. Headlining offers poured in not because club owners suddenly understood surrealism, but because Carson had given them cover. If Johnny approved, the risk disappeared. Within a few years, he had home box office specials and a Grammy-nominated album, I Have a Pony, released in 1986. A monotone voice telling one-liners about impossible dogs and actual-size maps was now something people paid money to listen to, no visuals needed. All because in a Chinese restaurant in Boston, a producer saw something bizarre, and Johnny Carson later told America, with his laughter, that bizarre could be brilliant. Roseanne Barr, the domestic goddess. August of 1985. A woman walks onto the Tonight Show stage, calls herself a domestic goddess, and then proceeds to torch the very idea. Roseanne Barr did not look or sound like television's idea of a leading lady. She was loud, working class, unapologetically frumpy. And instead of pretending housework and motherhood were her calling, she treated them like a bad joke played on half the population. "Housework," she snarled, "is a job you do that nobody notices until you do not do it." Other female comics had joked about domesticity, but usually as charming incompetence. "Oh, I burned the roast again. I am so silly." Barr's angle was different. She was not the problem. The system was, her material came straight from lived experience working-class Salt Lake City, married young, 3 kids by her mid-20s, doing stand-up in her late 20s just to vent. By the time she hit Carson's stage, she had been honing the bitterly honest domestic goddess for about 5 years. She was not mocking housewives. She was one, demanding the right to say out loud what millions felt privately. That authenticity landed like revelation. She joked about fantasizing over 5 minutes alone in the bathroom, about kids who never stopped needing something, about husbands who came home from work and acted like the hard part of the day was over. You could hear women in the audience laughing a notch louder laughter with a hint of, finally. The risk was obvious. Late-night television in 1985 preferred its women to be aspirational or adorable. Roseanne was neither. She was tired, broke, and angry, and fully unwilling to apologize for any of it. Carson watched. The crowd roared. Then he did something almost unheard of. On her first appearance, Johnny Carson gestured Roseanne Barr to the couch. At that moment, only one woman had ever received a debut couch invitation. This was not just approval. It was a declaration that her working-class frustration was prime-time material. 2 people were watching very closely, producers Marcy Carey and Tom Werner. They were hunting for a new kind of family show, one that looked nothing like the polished upper-middle-class sitcoms dominating the airwaves. Barr's set, and especially Carson's couch gesture, told them she could carry it, not just as a comedian, but as the center of an entire series. They signed her to a development deal. 3 years later, Roseanne premiered on American Broadcasting Company television. No manicured lawns, no glamorous kitchens, just a blue-collar Illinois family fighting bills, fatigue, and each other with dark humor. The debut drew over 21 million households, the highest-rated new show of the season. Television had spent decades pretending families like this did not exist. Now one of them was anchoring a hit series that would run 9 seasons. As you listen to these breakthroughs, we would love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these Carson moments would you most have wanted to witness live? And do you remember seeing any of them when they first aired? Every comic we have covered so far wanted the throne. The next one was offered it and turned it down. Garry Shandling, Walking Away from the Throne. By March 18, 1981, Garry Shandling already had what most comedy writers dream about: steady work on hit shows like Sanford and Son and Welcome Back, Kotter. He could have stayed behind the scenes for decades, anonymous but secure. Instead, he left safety and stepped directly into the crosshairs of the most intimidating comedy stage in America. Shandling's debut Tonight Show set did not just tell jokes, it dissected the act of telling jokes on The Tonight Show. He talked about being nervous, about wanting to impress Johnny, about the surreal mechanics of late night itself. He even joked about trying to earn a couch invitation, while actively trying to earn a couch invitation. It was meta before meta was a buzzword. This approach was dangerous. The unwritten rule of talk shows was, do not mention the machinery, pretend the magic is real. Shandling pulled back the curtain, then made the exposed strings and pulleys the punchline. And underneath the cleverness was genuine anxiety writer turned performer. Safe room turned pressure cooker channeled into a shared nervous breakdown. The audience was invited to laugh at with him. His writing chops showed. He layered callbacks, set up ideas early that paid off minutes later, played with expectations. It was comedy that rewarded attention, the opposite of disposable late-night chatter. Carson's verdict came in a single telling word: auspicious. Then came the payoff. Shandling had been joking about the entire time Carson gestured to the couch. On the couch, Shandling stayed in meta mode, gently teasing the very institution that had just embraced him. Carson loved it. Over the next decade, Shandling became one of The Tonight Show's most anticipated guests. When Joan Rivers left to host her own show in 1986, Carson chose Shandling as his permanent guest host. As Carson's 1992 retirement approached, executives courted Shandling aggressively to take over The Tonight Show throne. He had Carson's blessing, viewer familiarity, and critical respect. On paper, he was perfect. And then he did something almost unthinkable in Hollywood. He said no, repeatedly. The offer was staggering. The Tonight Show was the single most valuable franchise in late-night television. Hosting it meant guaranteed fame, a salary in the tens of millions, and the kind of cultural relevance most performers never touch. Agents, managers, and network executives all told Shandling the same thing: you do not say no to this. Nobody says no to this. Shandling said no anyway. Instead, Shandling used the clout Carson had given him to build something stranger and more personal. First came It's Garry Shandling Show, which ran from 1986 to 1990, a sitcom where the main character knew he was on a sitcom and routinely broke the fourth wall. Then The Larry Sanders Show, which ran from 1992 to 1998, a dark, intricate deconstruction of late-night television itself, showing the psychological strain behind the monologue's smiles. The man who could have inherited Carson's actual desk chose to satirize that desk instead. In an era when most comics dreamed of the throne, Garry Shandling proved the ultimate power move might be declining the crown. So far, every story has been about what Carson's approval could build. But there is another side: what happened when you lost it. The dark side, Carson's blacklist. If Carson's couch was a rocket launcher, his disapproval was a trapdoor. There was no written blacklist on The Tonight Show, no official memo banning names. But inside the building, everyone knew some people simply did not get booked, ever. The reasons ranged from creative disagreements to perceived betrayals to something as simple and final as Johnny not finding you funny. In a 3-network world where late night meant Carson or nothing, that quiet ban could freeze a career. The mechanics were subtle. A comic who had angered Carson did not get a dramatic confrontation. They just stopped getting calls. Agents were told the show was booked up for months. Months became years. The silence was the sentence. For many comics, the ban was not just professional, it was existential. In an era before cable specials, before comedy podcasts, before anyone could build a following on social media, The Tonight Show was the only national stage that mattered. Being shut out did not just slow your career, it could stop it entirely. Clubs booked comics partly based on television visibility. No Tonight Show meant fewer club dates, smaller fees, and a slow fade into regional obscurity. Some comics never knew exactly why they were banned. They would hear secondhand that Johnny had been unimpressed, or that a joke had landed wrong, or that someone on staff had taken offense on his behalf. The reasons were rarely explained, because they did not need to be. Carson did not owe anyone an explanation. He was not a government. He was a man with a television show, and that show happened to control who America laughed at. Sometimes the offense was artistic. In 1978, Jay Leno did a set Carson reportedly found too crude. Leno was effectively kept off the show for years. Only after proving his mainstream appeal elsewhere was he slowly welcomed back, in time to become Carson's eventual successor, a rare full rehabilitation from the naughty list. But the deepest wound was personal. No story captures this more than Joan Rivers. After decades of appearing on the show, and after becoming Carson's first permanent guest host, she accepted Fox's offer to host a competing late-night show in 1986. Her mistake, in Carson's eyes, was not just taking the gig, it was not telling him personally before the news broke. Carson felt blindsided, betrayed. He never spoke to her again, not once. Rivers was effectively banned from The Tonight Show during Carson's remaining years and, astonishingly, throughout Jay Leno's and Conan O'Brien's early tenures as well. The institutional memory of Carson's displeasure outlived his own time behind the desk. Rivers tried to repair the breach through letters and intermediaries. He refused. She sent handwritten notes. He did not respond. She asked mutual friends to intervene. They tried and failed. The door was shut, and it would never reopen. For the rest of her life, she would speak of him with a complicated mix of gratitude and grief. The man who had said, "You are going to be a star," had also become the man whose silence never lifted. This darker side of Carson's reign did not erase the careers he launched, but it underscored a larger truth. When power is that concentrated, the distinction between professional judgment and personal mood can blur. A couch invitation could make you. A quiet frown could erase you. And in the Carson era, there was no plan B. If this look back at the Carson era brings someone in your life to mind, a friend, a parent, or a fellow classic television fan, consider sharing this episode with them. But before we go, why did any of this matter so much? Why could one man's gesture change a life? The unrepeatable era. From the 1960s through the 1980s, America lived in a monoculture. 3 networks, no cable worth mentioning, no streaming, no social media. If you wanted national visibility as a comedian, you had Carson or you had The Road. 10 million people might see you in 7 minutes. One booking could change everything. A comic could walk into the studio unknown and walk out famous, not gradually, not algorithmically, but in a single shared national moment that half the country witnessed together. That is what made Carson's power so extraordinary and so dangerous. He could see talent that the rest of the industry missed. He elevated women, minorities, and surrealists who might never have found a mainstream audience without him. But that same concentration of power meant that one man's bad mood, one perceived slight, one crossed line could quietly erase someone from the national stage. Today, a comic might rise on TikTok, build a podcast audience, tour theaters, then land a streaming special. No single gatekeeper controls the floodgates. The paths to fame are wider, more numerous, and far more democratic. But the trade-off is singularity. Almost no one today experiences the kind of overnight transformation Drew Carey did when Carson's hand motion changed his life in a literal second. There is rarely a single, universally shared moment where half the country watches an unknown become a star in real time. Fame now builds in layers, platform by platform, algorithm by algorithm. It is steadier, but it is never as sudden and never as collectively felt. The Carson era gave us those moments, and the Blacklist tales remind us what it cost when all that power belonged to one man. We will never again see a single desk in Burbank decide so much about who gets to be famous and who does not. If you want more hidden stories from television's golden age, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. We would love to hear your favorite Carson moment in the comments below.